Welcome, friends, and get ready to listen as Rupert reads The Adventures of Grandfather Frog by Thornton W Burgess, chapters 19 through 21. Chapter 19. Grandfather Frog jumps into more trouble. Some people are heedless and run into trouble. Some people are stupid and walk into trouble. Grandfather Frog was both heedless and stupid and jumped into trouble. When Striped Chipmunk told him where the spring was, it seemed to him that he couldn't wait to reach it. You see, Grandfather Frog had spent all his life in the Smiling Pool, where he could get a drink whenever he wanted it, just by reaching over the edge of his big green lily pad. Whenever he was too warm, all he had to do was say, "Ja-rum," and dive headfirst into the cool water. So he wasn't used to going a long way without water. Jump, jump, jump. Grandfather Frog was going as fast as ever he could in the direction Striped Chipmunk had pointed out. Every 3 or 4 jumps, he would stop for a wee bit of rest. Then he would go again, jump, jump, jump. And every jump was a long one. Peter Rabbit certainly would have been envious if he could have seen those long jumps of Grandfather Frog. At last the ground began to grow damp. The further he went, the damper it grew. Presently it became fairly wet, and there was a great deal of soft, cool, wet moss. How good it did feel to Grandfather Frog's poor, tired feet. "Must be I'm almost there," said Grandfather Frog to himself as he scrambled onto a big, mossy hammock, so as to look around. Right away he saw a little path from the direction of the long lane. It led straight past the very hammock in which Grandfather Frog was sitting, and he noticed that where the ground was very soft and wet, old boards had been laid down. That puzzled Grandfather Frog a great deal. "It's a sure enough path," said he, "but what's under the blue sky does anyone want to spoil it for by putting those boards there?" You see, Grandfather Frog likes the soft, wet mud, and he couldn't understand how anyone, even Farmer Brown's boy, could prefer a hard, dry path. Of course, he never had worn shoes himself, so he couldn't understand why anyone should want dry feet when they could just as well have wet ones. He was still puzzling over it when he heard a sound that made him nearly lose his balance and tumble off the hummock. It was a whistle, the whistle of Farmer Brown's boy. Grandfather Frog knew it right away, because he had often heard it by the Smiling Pool. The whistle came over from the long lane. Farmer Brown's boy had had his dinner and was now on his way back to look for Grandfather Frog where he had been dropped. Grandfather Frog actually grinned as he thought how surprised Farmer Brown's boy was going to be when he couldn't find no trace of him. Suddenly, the smile seemed to freeze on Grandfather Frog's face. That whistle was coming nearer. Farmer Brown boy had left the long lane and was coming along the little path. The truth is, he was coming for a drink at the spring. But Grandfather Frog didn't think of this. He was sure that in some way Farmer Brown's boy had found out which way he had gone and was coming after him. He crouched down as flat as he could on the big hummock and held his breath. Farmer Brown's boy went straight past, just a few steps beyond, and stopped and knelt down. Peeping through the grass, Grandfather Frog saw him dig up beautiful clear water in an old cup and drink. Then Grandfather Frog knew just where the spring was. A few minutes later, Farmer Brown's boy passed again, still whistling, on his way to the long lane. Grandfather Frog waited only long enough to be sure that he had really gone. Then, with bigger jumps than ever, he started for the spring. A dozen long jumps, and he could see the water. 2 more jumps, then a long jump, and he had landed in the spring with a splash. "Ja-rum," cried Grandfather Frog. "How good the water feels!" And all the time, Grandfather Frog had jumped straight into more trouble. Chapter 20. Grandfather Frog Loses Heart. Look before you leap, the water may be deep. That is the very best kind of advice, but most people find out when it is too late. Grandfather Frog did. Of course, he had heard that little verse all his life. Indeed, he had been very fond of saying it to those who came to the Smiling Pool to ask for his advice. But Grandfather Frog seemed to have left all his wisdom behind him when he left the Smiling Pool to go out into the great world. You see, it is very hard work for anyone whose advice has been sought to turn right around and take advice themselves. So Grandfather Frog had been getting into scrapes ever since he started out his foolish journey, and now here he was in still another. And he had landed in head first, with a great splash. Of course, when he had seen the cool, sparkling water of the spring, it had seemed to him that he just couldn't wait another second to get into it. He was so hot and dry, and dreadfully thirsty and uncomfortable, and so, oh dear me, Grandfather Frog didn't look at all before he leaped. No, sir, he didn't. He just dived in with a great long jump. Oh, how good that water felt! For a few minutes he couldn't think of anything else. It was cooler than the water of the Smiling Pool, because, as you know, it was a spring. But it felt all the better for that, and Grandfather Frog just closed his eyes and floated there in pure happiness. Presently he opened his eyes to look around. Then he blinked them rapidly for a minute or so. He rubbed them to make sure he saw right. His heart seemed to sink right down, way down into his toes. "Jug-a-rum!" exclaimed Grandfather Frog. "Jug-a-rum!" And after that, for a long time, he didn't say a word. You see, it was this way. All around him rose perfectly straight, smooth walls, and he could look up and see a little of the blue sky right overhead, and whispering leaves of trees and bushes. Over the edge of the smooth, straight walls, grasses were bending, and they were so far above his head, so dreadfully far, there wasn't any place to climb out. Grandfather Frog was in a prison. He didn't understand it at all, but it was so. Of course, Farmer Brown's boy could have told him all about it. A long time before, Farmer Brown himself had found that spring, and because the water was so clear and cold and pure, he had cleared away all the dirt and rubbish around it. Then he had knocked the bottom of a nice, clean barrel, and had dug down while the water bubbled up out of the sand, and had set the barrel down into this hole, and had filled in the bottom with good, clean white sand for the water to bubble up through. About halfway up the barrel, he cut a little hole for the water to run out as fast as it bubbled in at the bottom. Of course, the water never could fill the barrel, because when it reached that hole, it ran out. This left a straight, smooth wall up above, a wall altogether too high for Grandfather Frog to jump over from inside. Poor old Grandfather Frog! He wished more than ever that he never thought of leaving the Smiling Pool to see the great world. Round and round he swam, but he couldn't see any way out of it. The little hole where the water ran out was too small for him to squeeze through, as he found out by trying and trying. As far as he could see, he had just got to stay there all the rest of his life. Worse still, he knew that Farmer Brown's boy sometimes came to the spring for a drink, for he had seen him do it. That meant that the very next time he came, he would find Grandfather Frog, because there was no place to hide. When Grandfather Frog thought of that, he just lost heart. Yes, sir, he just lost heart. He gave up all hope of ever seeing the Smiling Pool again, and 2 big tears ran out of his big, goggly eyes. Chapter 21. The Merry Breezes Come to Comfort Grandfather Frog. When the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind had left Grandfather Frog in the long lane where Farmer Brown's boy had dropped him, and hurried as fast as ever they could to find some of his friends to help him, not one of them had been successful. Not one was at home, and no one was in any of the places where they usually were to be found. The Merry Little Breezes looked and looked. Then one by one they sadly turned back to the long lane. They felt so badly that they just hated to go back where they had left Grandfather Frog. When they got there, they found Striped Chipmunk, who now was scolding Farmer Brown's boy as fast as his tongue could go. "Where is he?" cried the Merry Little Breezes excitedly. Striped Chipmunk stopped scolding long enough to point to Farmer Brown's boy, who was hunting in the grass for some trace of Grandfather Frog. "But we didn't mean him, you stupid! We can see him for ourselves. Where's Grandfather Frog?" cried the Merry Little Breezes, all speaking at once. I don't know. And what's more, I don't care. Now, this wasn't true, for a striped chipmunk isn't that unkind. It was mostly talk, and the Merry Little Breezes knew it. They knew that Striped Chipmunk really thinks a great deal of Grandfather Frog, just as they do. So they pretended not to notice what he said or how put out he seemed. After a while, he told them that he had sent Grandfather Frog free, and that he had started for the spring on the other side of the long lane. The Merry Little Breezes were delighted to hear the good news, and they said such a lot of nice things to Striped Chipmunk that he quite forgot to scold Farmer Brown's boy. Then they started for the spring, dancing merrily, for they felt sure that Grandfather Frog was all right, and they expected to find him quite at home. "Hello, Grandfather Frog!" they shouted, and peeped into the spring. "How do you like your new home?" Grandfather Frog made no reply. He just rolled his great goggly eyes up at them, and they were full of tears. What, Grandfather Frog, what is the matter now?" they cried. "Jug of rum," said Grandfather Frog, and his voice sounded all choky. "I can't get out." Then they noticed for the first time how straight and smooth the walls of the spring were, and how far down Grandfather Frog was. And they knew that he spoke the truth. They tried bending down the grasses that grew around the edge of the spring, but none were long enough to reach the water. If they had stopped to think, they would have known that Grandfather Frog couldn't have climbed up by them anyway. Then they tried to lift a big stick into the spring, but it was too heavy for them, and they couldn't move it. However, they did manage to blow an old shingle in, and that gave Grandfather Frog something to sit on, so that he began to feel a little better. Then they said all the comforting things they could think of. They told him that no harm could come to him there unless Farmer Brown's boy should happen to see him. "That's just what I'm afraid of," croaked Grandfather Frog. "He is sure to see me if he comes for a drink, for there is no place for me to hide." "Perhaps he won't come," said one of the Merry Little Breezes hopefully. "If he does come, you can hide under the piece of shingle, and then he won't know you are here at all," said another. Grandfather Frog brightened up. "That's so," said he. "That's a good idea, and I'll try it." Then one of the Merry Little Breezes promised to keep watch for Farmer Brown's boy, and all the others started off on another hunt for someone to help Grandfather Frog out of his new trouble. And that's the end of this read, and if you liked it, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you.